Scott, you asked earlier about all the fact-checking groups and trust and how does the media deal with fact checks without overwhelming people. I think if we elevate this topic just a little bit, this is really about trust and who do news consumers trust as sources? What claims do news consumers trust? And our approach at NewsGuard is very much around disclosure and basic practices. So when we rate NBC or other media outlets, we're looking at completely basic practices. Does the source repeatedly publish false content? Does it disclose ownership? Does it separate news and opinion in some way that consumers can understand it? Nothing that any of us would find shocking. On the other hand, we've rated all the news and information sources in 9 countries around the world that account for 95% of engagement in those countries. And in the US, 40% of the sources we've rated get an untrustworthy rating. It's not just political sites, it's healthcare hoax sites, conspiracy sites of all kinds. But we have to recognize that consumers are living in a world where, as they thumb through TikTok or roam around YouTube or they're in their Facebook feed, they really have very little idea who's feeding them the news, how much of it is an algorithm suggesting that if they've spent some time on one conspiracy, that they'll like another conspiracy. How much of it is websites that were created last week that look like they were created 200 years ago. And so I think the biggest challenge is how can media outlets regain the trust to be able to be trusted and to call out claims that are provably false and to do it in a nonpartisan manner so that they're trusted by everyone. That's a high order, especially now.
Yeah, no, it is. To go to Bill Holstein's question in the chat about how sophisticated is TikTok, has 170 million American viewers. Could they, for example, he asks, communicate one set of realities to the viewers who support one candidate and another set of realities to the other? Are they that sophisticated in their algorithms, or even, would that be a goal that they would even be interested in? I'm not sure.
The answers are yes and yes. This is in the nature of algorithmically driven businesses. We saw this first with Facebook and famously with Facebook, that advertising dependent businesses have every incentive to maximize engagement, time spent, page views, because every one of those could lead to revenue. And the algorithms may or may not be programmed politically in a partisan way, but they are absolutely geared to maximize engagement. And so, of course, if you spend time on TikTok on pro-Harris videos, you're going to get more and more of them. Likewise, on the other side. That's in the nature of the algorithm. So when we say that we live in bubbles, we most certainly live in bubbles. And that's the design of so much of social media.
Would you say that TikTok is, does it have a mission that way, or is it just the incentives that are set up by the algorithms make it so?
We did a report not too long ago about YouTube where we tested typical users. And the question we asked was, how likely is it that somebody on TikTok will encounter misinformation on a topic in the news in the first couple of hours that they're using TikTok that day? And the answer was 20% of the time. It's not 80% of the time, but it's 20% of the time. If David had a reporter who was accurate only 80% of the time, he'd be concerned. I had the chance to ask the then COO of YouTube. I asked her at a public conference, I said, it looks like 20% of the time somebody's getting information on some topic in the news. At that time, it was COVID and Ukraine. I said, 20% of the time they're getting false information from TikTok. And I asked her, is that what you're shooting for? Are you shooting for 20%? Would you rather have 10%? What's your goal? And she did not answer my question. So, Scott, I can't answer your question about motive or intent or what they think is reasonable. But I think those of us who expect something closer to 99.9% reliability than to 80% reliability are rightly aghast at what social media has done to the information environment.
Did you apply that analysis to X or Twitter?
We have done different versions of that with Facebook, with X. I would say none of them does well.
Yeah. David?
And I just as the father of a 14-year-old and 10-year-old girls, boys, doesn't matter. Two girls in my case, but the influence of TikTok is just, enormous. For a generation, it's a primary source of information. And it's fascinating because they'll recognize some piece of actual news and it will like intrigue them and interest them, but they, I just think the ability of it's, they may be more digitally literate as they get older. They may be more, skeptical of what they see online. But right now, it's the equivalent of, I guess television for all of us when we were young, or it's the normal place they get their information, and all their friends get their information, and 80% of it is, relatively harmless, at least, So, and I'll bring it up now because it's somewhat in the questions, but to me, the big issue is Section 230 and the fact that none of these platforms face any financial or, penalty or liability for all of the content they're posting. I mean, you mentioned, I only thought it's because Gordon talked about, firing a reporter who's only right 80% of the time. 99.9% is what the NBC legal department wants is 100%. And that's what we all want as editors. And that is because, NBC, the Wall Street Journal, you all know this, can be sued for defaming people. Facebook, X, TikTok cannot. And I understand that, that not having that exemption was, adopted decades ago to help these platforms grow, but it just seems like an obvious way to at least create a cost to putting up false and defamatory information that just doesn't exist now for these platforms.
Yeah, Mike.
You're not going to get any disagreement on this topic between me and David.
And I'm not, and we've got journalists who are watching this, but look, it's not perfect. Only rich people have the money to sue NBC News. It doesn't really help average people who are defamed, but we have lawyers reading our stories. We reach out to everybody for comment, and that's because we're professional journalists, but it's also because, a libel suit can be a massive financial blow to a journalistic organization, and it does deter us in certain ways. It slows us down, and that's good. And it's up to the courts. I don't want to see some U.S. government truth commission deciding what's defamatory and what's not. Let it be fought out in the legal system.
The way I think about this issue is, one, I understand why in the mid-90s Congress and the Clinton administration didn't want to create liability for the internet. We were just moving to the commercial internet. It was not very well understood. We're now almost 30 years later, and we can definitely see what happens when you immunize a complete industry from basic common law tort liability. If you immunize somebody from liability, they're going to act as if they're immunized from liability. If you say you're not going to be held responsible, they're going to behave irresponsibly. That, we should have realized that at the time. we certainly realize it now. And, you know, it is an unfortunate fact that it's been difficult to restore basic liability rules to social media platforms in particular. There have been efforts in the UK, in Europe, there have been some efforts here, but not in time to affect the upcoming election.